We're very lucky to have back with us Holly Barker. Holly Barker is an applied anthropologist who has over 18 years of experience working in the Marshall Islands and with political leaders in the Marshall Islands. First as a Peace Corps volunteer on Mealy Atoll, and later as the senior advisor to the Embassy of the Republic of the Marshall Islands in Washington, D.C. She is author of the book Bravo for the Marshallese, Regaining Control in a Post-Nuclear, Post-Colonial World, co-author of the Consequential Damages of Nuclear War, the Rongelap Report, and contributor to the book Half-Lives and Half-Truths, Confronting the Radioactive Legacies of the Cold War. And she currently lectures full-time at the Anthropology Department at the University of Washington, where she teaches classes including U.S. Nuclear Policy and Environmental Health and Public Policy, Hanford. So let's talk about what the U.S. has done to the Marshall Islands and the Marshallese. Start out, if you would, and give us a kind of an overview of U.S. nuclear testing there in the Marshall Islands.
Yeah, sure. Be happy to. Right after World War II, the United Nations gave the United States administering authority for the Marshall Islands, which meant that the U.S. government was the only government or power that was essentially like a colonial government of the Marshall Islands. And so the U.S. realized that it had gotten a geographically isolated location in the Pacific that was very far away from the eyes of the U.S. public, but also from the Soviets. And the U.S. decided to use that area to test its most secret weapons at the time, its atomic weapons. And so in 1946, the U.S. launched a program to better understand the impacts of its newest weapon, the nuclear weapon, which until that time had only been used in Japan at the end of the war. And so from 1946 to 1958, the U.S. conducted 67 atmospheric nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands. And it comes out to the equivalent of about 1.6 Hiroshima bombs every single day for that entire 12 years. And so, although differently from the Japanese, the Marshallese definitely know what it's like to experience nuclear war.
And how is it that the U.S. was allowed to oversee the Marshall Islands as opposed to another nation?
Right. Well, the United States...
Or just their own oversight?
Right. Well, at the end of World War II, the Japanese and the U.S. had fought bitterly in the Marshall Islands. Japan had a military occupation of the Marshall Islands going into the war. And so the U.S. had essentially liberated the Marshallese from a Japanese regime at the time. And so the U.S. was seen as the likely power to be.
But were they considered their own nation prior to that?
You know, it had been about 400 years of constant occupation by outsiders. So the Spanish, the German, the Japanese, and then the Americans after that. And then, we can get to this later on, but eventually in 1986, the U.S. administration came to an end, and the Marshallese have been, in charge of their own nation since 1986.
So how did the U.S. propose this plan to the Marshallese, or did they even ask?
Yeah, there's some great footage of this, and it's almost like Hollywood footage where, the Navy administration goes to the leaders of Bikini Atoll, which eventually became one of the ground zero testing sites, and brought together the community and sat them down and said, we want you to be involved in helping us do something that will bring peace to the world, and God wants us to do this, sort of drawing on the fact that it was the divine right of the U.S. to test and to have these weapons. And the U.S. didn't really know what these weapons were going to do at the time, so they had no ability to, accurately portray what the effects would be like for the Marshallese. So they sort of did this general request for permission, which, are you with us? Are you on God's side? Are you going to help us promote world peace? If you do, say yes. And the leaders said, yes. Here was a powerful group of people who had just gotten rid of a very tyrannical Japanese regime, which had been very brutal during the wartime. And they had a lot of faith in their new friends. And so when their new friends asked for permission to utilize their land to bring peace to the world, it was without a full understanding of what the impacts of nuclear weapons would do.
So what were their thoughts once they started seeing the effects of these nuclear weapons being used?
Yeah, Marshallese were asked to sacrifice an awful lot. And for some communities, they had to leave their homelands entirely and go live on other people's lands, or even live on some of the naval vessels at sea for several months, floating in the waters while the Navy and then the U.S. government ended up using their lands. The Marshallese had to endure, once they were exposed to the radiation, illness and other difficulties, but it wasn't until 1954 when the U.S. tested its largest test ever. By this point, they had figured out thermonuclear weapons, too, so they had progressed from the atomic to the thermonuclear weapons. And in March 1st, 1954, an anniversary date that's coming up here shortly, the U.S. tested the Bravo event, which was the equivalent of about 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. And it was planned by the U.S. to be the biggest and dirtiest weapon it had ever tested. And so that particular detonation caused a lot of illness and despair amongst the Marshallese. And after that event, there was a petition that went to the United Nations by the Marshallese. The Marshallese did everything they were supposed to in terms of, protesting the events and the occupation of the U.S. of their lands for the testing purposes. And so they drafted a petition to the United Nations calling on the U.S. To end the testing program. And because it was a colonial arrangement at the time, it was the United States that spoke for the Marshall Islands at the United Nations. And so the ambassador at the time went to the Secretary General of the United Nations and said, I have this petition from the Marshallese, but we need to finish our testing series. And so the U.S. and the United Nations agreed to hold on to the Marshallese petition, finish the detonations that had been scheduled, and then to bring the petition forward to the United Nations. And by then, they had finished their testing series. So the Marshallese protested loudly and vigorously and through appropriate channels, but because the U.S. was the colonial speaker for the Marshallese at the time, there was no ability to do anything differently. And it's, we see this right now with France and French Polynesia, for instance, when that colonial arrangement is still in place. The Tahitian people, the people of French Polynesia, aren't able to protest what the colonial power is doing.
So talk some more about the effects of the 67 nuclear weapons that the U.S. detonated on the Marshallese, both to the islands themselves, some of which I know were obliterated, as well as the people.
Right. Yeah, in terms of the land itself, there are only 70 square miles of land in the entire country. So land is the most precious resource there is. Land is where people get their social identity. It's where they get their economic support, their livelihood. It determines where you're buried, where you can live. You're everything about who you are in the world. And so we don't have that equivalent in the Western world. If my land in Seattle became irradiated, I would pick up and move someplace else. And sure, I would miss it a whole lot. But there isn't that sense of connection to place that a lot of indigenous communities have. And so for the Marshallese, when their land was either obliterated, as in, it no longer exists because it was vaporized by the test, or it became too contaminated to live on, then that had sort of catastrophic implications for Marshallese culture and for the people, in a way that we can never fully appreciate in a Western sense. In terms of the health impacts, the radiation impacts have been severe in the Marshall Islands. And, radiation is mutagenic, and so it causes cells to mutate. Anything that's alive, plants, animals, people. And so when the people were exposed to radiation, the DNA begins to get altered. And so this gets passed on for several generations. And so it's not just the Marshallese who were alive during the testing period. Certainly the people who were alive then suffered incredible burdens and probably suffered the most out of all the Marshallese. But this isn't an issue that's gone away. It's not just a historical event, because the violence of the testing program is imprinted in the DNA of the people, and they carry it on. For instance, a woman has her full supply of eggs in her body when she's born. And so when your eggs begin to get exposed to radiation, that's all your reproductive potential that gets affected. And so we're, in the Marshall Islands, you see second, third generation effects. And, as an anthropologist, I've done a lot of interviewing with the Marshallese and talking particularly with the women who've been exposed to radiation. And certainly the reproductive abnormalities have been one of the most acute experiences for the Marshallese, and certainly one of the saddest and most disturbing events.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? I know, again, and you are unique in this position that you actually have done oral histories with the Marshallese. Talk about some of the birth problems that women have had there.
Yeah, I was fortunate to work for the Marshall Islands government, and they've got some brave and fabulous political leaders who, in the post-colonial relationship have been trying to assert their right to reclaim the history of the nuclear weapons testing. And so when I was working for the Marshall Islands government, they asked me to conduct these oral histories because the Marshallese government thought that the U.S. sort of account of history of what the testing had done didn't fully grasp the scope of the damages and injuries that the Marshallese people were experiencing. And so the U.S. had always really minimized what the effects of the testing program were, whereas the Marshallese knew about it but had never really had an opportunity to document it fully. Because during the colonial relationship, it was all U.S. scientists and U.S. health physicists and all of the people who were involved in the testing program were U.S. researchers, and so that information was controlled and interpreted by the U.S. government. So post-1986 became an opportunity for the Marshallese government to do its own research. And so the Marshall Islands government had asked me to conduct oral histories with a lot of the people and communities who were downwind from the nuclear weapons testing. And I began to focus quite a bit on the women as a result. I think of, me being a woman and having access to the women made it, I guess a likely research project. And so what the women began to tell me, there's certain themes started to emerge as I talked to them. I probably did more than 200 interviews with folks who were directly downwind from the testing program. But the women in particular would talk about, how before the testing program, Marshallese had always had stillbirths or miscarriages because they had always existed, as they do in any human population. But after their exposure to radiation, they started to give birth to what they considered almost non-human offspring that they had never seen before. And what was interesting is embedded in the language are clues about these new reproductive abnormalities. That the women had to devise an entirely new language, really, to describe what they were giving birth to, because the Marshallese language never had these words before, because they had never been exposed to radiation before, so they didn't need them. And so women started talking about giving birth to grape babies. And grape babies are, in English we call them hydatiform molar pregnancies, which are extremely rare. They're maybe about 1 in a million. But it's when mitosis begins and after conception and the cells start to divide. At some point with the hydatiform molar pregnancy, the cells stop dividing and then just start to grow and get large. And when a woman looks like she's pregnant and goes through all the steps of pregnancy, and then at the end give birth to what the Marshallese essentially call grapes. It looks like a bunch of grapes of like large purple cells. And the frequency of this occurrence is evident in the fact that they gave it a name because they had to. It wasn't such an anomaly that people talked about it as one event. It became prevalent enough that they had to devise words for that. And so within the Marshallese language, there's evidence of women giving birth to what they call, coconut head babies or sailfish babies. If you can, picture the big marlin fish with the protrusions of the fin on the back. And that's because many of the babies were born with the spines actually outside of their body or with grotesque deformations along the spine. And so they look to their local environment and look for non-human words within an island atoll ecosystem to try, to describe what was indescribable, if that makes any sense.
And in addition to the women having to deal with their children coming out deformed like that, how did the rest of the Marshallese society respond to these events?
Yeah. Well, in terms of illnesses, there's the thyroid. There's been a lot of thyroid illness and thyroid cancer that's been associated with the radiation exposure. There have been a lot of cancers in the Marshall Islands. Again, we know when people are exposed to radiation that radiation is cancer causing. And so there's a high incidence of cancer throughout the Marshall Islands. What I find most difficult and just really unbelievable is that we know radiation causes cancer, and still today, the testing ended in 1958. Still today, there's no oncologist in the Marshall Islands. And so there's no, if you get cancer in the Marshall Islands today, in 2012, there's no chemotherapy that's available in the Marshall Islands. There's no oncologist that you can go to and talk to about cancer treatment. There's no facility in the Marshall Islands to deal with your cancer. And so cancer can essentially be a death sentence for the Marshallese, and it's only those that have the means or the wealth or the ability or the family connections to get themselves out of the country to find treatment elsewhere who have the best chances of survival. And to me, I think that's one of the most difficult aspects of the whole testing program is that, in the Cold War, maybe the United States did not know a whole lot about the impacts of the weapons and what they would have done, and that's being generous in critique. Maybe they didn't fully understand the potential of the weapons, but certainly after the fact, with our knowledge today, I just find it inexcusable for the U.S. government to not provide the health care that the Marshallese people need as a result of their radiation exposure. Because the events in the Marshall Islands essentially led the U.S. to win the Cold War. We used our proving ground to prove that we had the best nuclear arsenal and we were the strongest nation. And for the Marshallese, what do they get? And they've got illness and they've got displacement and an inability to be on their homelands. And for their future generations to be sacrificed for this. And so I feel like we have a debt in this nation to the Marshallese. The Marshallese, there's a lot of U.S. security that came at the price for the Marshallese. And I think we owe them for that.
If one watches the films that were made about the U.S. nuclear testing there, you frequently see segments of U.S. scientists and or doctors examining the Marshallese after these tests, were they giving them medical help then, or were they just recording the results of their tests?
Yeah. It's another disturbing aspect of this whole history. Following the Bravo event in 1954, the United States set up a top secret medical program that was called Project 4.1. And Project 4.1 was to study the effects of radiation on human beings. And, prior to this time, the United States had conducted lots of medical experiments exposing animals like lab rats to radiation and understanding what radiation would do to these animals. But the Marshall Islands became an opportunity for the U.S. to take it to the next step, to understand what radiation would do to human beings. And so there were aspects of purposeful exposure of Marshallese to radiation for the purpose of scientific study, with the idea that if the U.S. was ever in a nuclear war, the U.S. needed to understand how its citizens would fare. Or if U.S. soldiers were sent into a nuclear exchange, the U.S. government would know how the soldiers would survive. And so the Marshallese did become human test subjects to study the effects of radiation. And some of this we see with the community of Rongelap in particular. Rongelap was an atoll that's the closest inhabited atoll to Bikini, the ground zero location. And so when the U.S. was getting ready to detonate the Bravo shot on March 1st, 1954, previously, for much smaller shots, the U.S. had relocated the Rongelapese as a precautionary measure, taken them off of their homelands while they conducted these tests, just to remove them from harm's way. But then on the day that the U.S. had decided, okay, they're getting ready to test their largest weapon ever, they purposely decided to leave the Rongelapese there. Also, weather accounts from the morning and the evening before the test shot show that the winds were blowing towards Rongelap and that the U.S. government was aware of that, and that the winds were blowing exactly from the test site to Rongelap. On the eve of the Bravo test, there was also a U.S. naval ship that was anchored right at Rongelap. And that naval ship stayed when the Bravo shot was detonated. And then when it began to pick up the radiation cloud that was moving towards Rongelap and confirmed that radiation had come to Rongelap, that ship took off. It left, and it left without taking the people of Rongelap with it. There had been an opportunity. They could have removed the Marshallese and evacuated them from Rongelap, but they didn't. And so the people stayed as the radiation coated their islands. And for communities like Rongelap that had never seen radiation before, when the radioactive ash fell from the nuclear detonation, the people thought it was snow in many cases. I interviewed people who said that they went out and played in it because they had always heard about snow or seen pictures of snow, but they had never experienced it before. So when the white powder or ash fell from the sky, they went out, kids put it on their eyes like makeup or on their lips like lipstick. Some people tasted it and wanted to see how it smelled and put it in their pockets or brought it home. And so they really didn't have an understanding of the dangers because the U.S. hadn't conveyed that to them before. And then once this community of Rongelap had been exposed to the radiation, the U.S. government left them there for about 2 days before coming in and evacuating them. And then the U.S. came in and evacuated them and moved them to Kwajalein Atoll, which was a military base at the time, put them in a barbed wire and camp, a barbed wire fenced-off area where the U.S. doctors came in and enrolled them into this top-secret medical program, Project 4.1, without their knowledge or without their consent. And this project became a study to monitor what radiation would do to the people. Not treating them, not taking care of their illnesses as, a normal doctor-patient relationship would be to try to improve the health or well-being of the subjects. But this was to take photographs of, what do the burns in the skin look like, and then to watch it over time to really understand what the effects would be. And so, the Marshallese that I interviewed would often talk about how, they had burns that went down to their bones, where the bones were visible, and their feet, they were in agony. And all the U.S. would do was take pictures of their illnesses and, without giving them painkillers, without giving them treatments. It was, they understood right from the beginning that they were like test subjects. And it's interesting because the Marshallese had to, again, going back to the language, they had to borrow a term from the English language to sort of convey these experiences as research subjects. And now you hear Marshallese talk about being guinea pigs. And that animal, the guinea pig, doesn't exist in the Marshall Islands, but that term is needed to convey the dehumanization that they felt as being test subjects.
And they can't get medical help to this day.
Right. Well, medical help is severely limited in the Marshall Islands. So if you were from one of two communities, Rongelap and Utrecht, that are two downwind communities, if you were on one of those two areas on March 1st, 1954, then the U.S. presumes that you are exposed to radiation from the Bravo test. If you were somewhere else in the Marshall Islands for any of the other 66 atmospheric nuclear weapons tests that were detonated, that doesn't really figure into it. But if you were downwind on Rongelap or Utrecht on March 1st, 1954, then you'd be eligible for a medical program that's provided by the Department of Energy. The offspring of any of these people are not eligible for any compensation. Communities that were resettled on highly contaminated lands are not eligible for any medical assistance. And so there's a tiny portion of the population is eligible for some health care. It's not complete health care because it's only for certain illnesses, things like thyroid or cancer, but not for other illnesses that we now know are linked to radiation exposure. And so U.S. assistance has been wholly inadequate for the Marshallese.
We're talking with Holly Barker. She is author of several books, Bravo for the Marshallese, Regaining Control in a Post-Nuclear, Post-Colonial World, and co-author of The Consequential Damages of Nuclear War, the Rongelap Report. And you are going to be speaking this coming Friday here in Seattle.
I am.
It's coming Friday, February 24th at 7:30 p.m. at University Temple United Methodist Church here in Seattle. Across the street it's at 1415 Northeast 43rd, right behind the post office. And the subject is from nuclear weapons to nuclear energy, the U.S., the Marshall Islands, and Japan. So,
love to connect with people. Thanks, Mike.